Hello, everybody. I'm Zaina Lutfia, and this is
Rick Fries.
And we're from the University of Manitoba, and we're very pleased to be talking to you again. And today our presentation is about self-determination and inclusive education.
There have been a lot of conceptualizations of self-determination. We're going to look at four of them that are probably the most prominent, and then we're going to focus in on one of them which we think is most relevant to education. So self-determination has been conceptualized as empowerment, as innate motivation, as learned behavior, and as self-advocacy. But in all cases, the rationale for self-determination is to improve the quality of life of the individual who is taking action on their own behalf.
Okay, so the first conceptualization of self-determination is empowerment, and that is the circumstances and actions that would help enhance the possibilities for people to control their lives.
This is something that comes from the outside to the inside, so it's the circumstances the person finds themselves in that bring about the empowerment. So it's an external reference rather than an internal one. Self-determination has also been seen from an internal perspective as motivation. In other words, an innate propensity to engage in personal interest, to exercise personal capacities, and to overcome personal challenges.
And of course, motivation comes from that internal sense of the person, but we also have a conceptualization of self-determination as learned behavior. And that is, we pay attention to the lifelong learning opportunities and experiences that result in an individual becoming the main mover of things that happen in his or her own life.
So in other words, the uniting of the internal and the external through education. So let's explore self-determination as learned behavior a little bit more. From the point of view of educators, obviously a definition that involves learning makes the most sense. And it involves four main components. The first is autonomy, the second is self-regulation, the third is the internal locus of control for the individual, and the fourth is self-knowledge.
So when you think of autonomy, that does come from the Greek, autos, so it's self-rule is what it translates as, and it comes through being able to and learning how to make choices and decisions that are free from undue influence on the part of others. This type of autonomy is not the same as independence. So some may depend on technology or other people in order to help them reach their outcomes that they wish for themselves in their lives.
The second component of self-determination as learned behavior is self-regulation. This is the individual's awareness of the environmental opportunities and constraints that they face. It's self-awareness of their personal possibilities and their personal limitations within the environments in which they work, the communities in which they live, the places where they go to school, and the ability to make decisions about how to act is a key component of self-regulation.
And other points to make about self-regulation is that the individual would have the ability to evaluate outcomes of his or her own personal actions and be able to change their mind and revise decisions as necessary and as circumstances dictate. And so this is not the same as agency. Again, some people may depend on technology or other people in order to reach the outcomes that they hope to reach in their own lives.
The fourth element of self-determination as learned behavior is in the internal locus of control. This means that the individual has control over personal circumstances, and it also means that they have what we call self-efficacy. They have the skills that they need to achieve desired outcomes, either directly as their own agent or through helpers or through technology. This also involves outcome expectation. It means that the individual not only has the skills to do something, but they have a reasonable understanding and a reasonable expectation that their results will be achieved if they apply the skills, that's a reasonable belief to hold. And this is not, again, the same as self-sufficiency. The person doesn't have to necessarily do this themselves. They may be able to instruct others on what to do. And so other people and other technologies may be used to exercise control.
Okay, another component of self-determination as learned behavior is developing knowledge of oneself. of one's own personal strengths and limitations, and how these personal strengths can be supported and enhanced, either through ways of learning, through different technologies, through personal supports or peer supports, institutional services, and so on. So all of the different supports that a person may have available to both make decisions but also to carry out one's own decisions. And then how to select or modify one's environment, one's physical environment, that in ways that affect their personal learning and ability to make decisions would also be part of this aspect of self-determination.
So self-knowledge involves knowledge of your own personal limitations and how they can be mitigated, knowledge of how to appeal to get the provisions that you need and to appeal against inadequate provisions, in other words, to protest, and how to access and use institutional and social support for advocacy and inclusion. So it's basically knowing how to work the system in favor of your own ends.
So as we said at the start, self-determination, one of the reasons for it in the first place, is to help lead to an improved quality of life for individuals. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time now talking about what goes into what's considered when we think about quality of life. And so quality of life is made up of the same factors and relationships that are important to anybody who doesn't have disabilities. So it would be the same for people with and without disabilities. And quality of life is experienced when a person's or his or her family's or community's basic needs are met. And then when a person has the same opportunities as anyone else has in order to pursue and to achieve their goals in the major life settings of their home, of their community, and of work.
Yeah, I'd just like to emphasize the idea that it's not just personal self-determination. If the people who surround and support an individual with disabilities, their family or the peers that work with them in the classroom or the community of people who are supporters, don't have self-determination, don't understand it, then it's going to detract from the individual self-determination. So sometimes this is a group thing as opposed to just an individual thing. Quality of life is some other characteristics are also it's grounded in the person's own life and in their family's life, and especially in the strengths that they have as individuals and within the context of their family. It varies over the course of a lifetime. Obviously, babies are much more dependent and lack self-determination in comparison to people in the older people, like teenagers or young adults or in adulthood. And often when people are elderly, they lose the capacity, some of the things that define self-determination. It also needs to be congruent with public values and behavior. So in other words, self-determination is not about just striking off and doing something crazy and radical. It's something that other people would recognize and value, and it's something that's validated by the viewpoints of the people around you. Otherwise, you get a situation where somebody's doing something that may be good, but everybody else is plotting against them for striking out on their own. So it's important that there be some congruence, some supporters for individuals.
Okay, now we're going to talk about some limitations to self-determination. And the first one is age. So often there are formal restrictions, that is laws, that apply for anybody, whether they have disability or not, and they're applied on the basis of age. So the age of voting, the ability to make a contract, to get your driver's license, and so on. That's one form of limitation on making your own decisions. There are also informal restrictions in terms of custom. And so that may come down to prejudice or discrimination, may come down to tradition about what kinds of things people of a certain age may be able to decide for themselves, and environmental barriers and so on. And so typically these age restrictions in self-determination are the same for people whether or not they have disabilities.
A second area of limitation for self-determination for individuals is experience. In some cases, an individual may lack the experience to understand the implications of the decisions that they're making. Sometimes they're not aware of alternative options. Sometimes they lack the capacity to actually do something. They don't have the strength or the stamina or the skill set that they need. They may have lacked the developmental experiences that they need. If other people have been doing things for them as they're growing up, for example, dressing them, then they never develop the skills of learning how to dress themselves. So it's important that we understand that self-determination doesn't just blossom when you turn 18 or something. It's something that's based on a development that is occurring throughout the person's life and an attitude that the caregivers have towards the development of self-determination. There also may be low expectations for certain individuals that are grounded in their gender, in their disability, in racial prejudice, or in other forms of discrimination.
Okay. Other examples of limits to self-determination based on one's experience is the lack of technology that might be helpful to provide accommodations for individuals to carry out what they would like to do. Sometimes it's the environment itself that isn't very inclusive, and that's a limitation. There may also be a lack of inclusive policies, teaching, for instance, in the school system, and a lack of scaffolding or supported learning for individuals who in fact need to rely on that in order to learn the skills that they need for self-determination.
Impairments, intellectual impairments or physical impairments can also get in the way of self-determination. Someone may lack the ability intellectually to be aware of the opportunities that there are, or they may lack the requisite developmental experiences to understand those opportunities. They may not be aware of the supports that they could marshal to assist them to become more self-determined. And they may lack the ability to communicate the decisions that they have to other people successfully.
And continuing with impairments, these impairments may vary over time. So people may have more or less significant impairments. People may require, or many people may require, good faith advocates and interveners on their behalf, at least in certain situations for certain things. And some individuals may in fact need protection from exclusion, from exploitation, and from indifference.
The last kind of barrier to or limit to self-determination, I think it's the last one, is poor judgment, the inability to make wise decisions due to a lack of self-awareness, the inability to make wise decisions due to a misunderstanding of the circumstances that the person is in, or a lack of knowledge of what kinds of learning scaffolds or technologies or peer and personal supports might be available. So it's possible for someone to just have poor judgment, and parents all know about this when they see their preteens trying to make adult decisions and not really having the ability to make wise decisions yet, in that case because of age, but that could also just be a poor judgment that carries into adult life.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about some practical implications that can be considered when we're thinking about helping people experience self-determination and become better able to make those kinds of determinations and decisions for themselves. And so one very practical implication is to create opportunities for people that are developmentally appropriate for them. So for instance, helping people gain more control over their personal environment, where they live and spend their time, engagement in personal interests, and of course that's something that really changes as an individual gets older. They get to decide who they're friends with, who they spend time with, the groups or clubs they join at school or outside in the community. And over time, make sure that people have the opportunity to exercise the capacities and the strengths that they do have, and to really build on those as a foundation for self-determination. As well, it's important to help people face and struggle with personal challenges and ultimately to overcome them. But when any of us learn how to make decisions and so on, we also experience a lack of success. And then we have to learn what that means when something didn't go as we had hoped. And so that's another challenge that people need to have.
This idea of developmentally appropriate opportunities to control your environment is really important it's very easy for the parent of a disabled child to do things for them because it's quicker, it's easier, they see how difficult it is for their child to do something. And it may be simple things like turning off and on the light before they go to bed, setting the alarm to get up in the morning, getting dressed in the morning, getting their teeth brushed or whatever. And the parent starts to take over all of those duties. And the question that the parents need to ask themselves is, at what age would a non-disabled child start to take on the task of turning off and on the light, setting the alarm, dressing themselves, brushing their own teeth,
Chores.
getting their own breakfast, whatever. And in the classroom, you want to be looking and saying, what would the non-disabled student be doing at this particular moment during instruction or during learning or practicing something? And then they should try to create the opportunities for the individual with disabilities to be able to do something that is equivalent, if not the same. Creating opportunities for developmentally appropriate choice making, for decision making, for problem solving, and for setting goals and then monitoring success or progress towards those goals. These are all really important elements. It's important not to think, oh, this person has a disability, I'll simplify life for them by taking away the choices or taking away the decisions or taking away the problems when they encounter them and assisting them with those. They need to struggle and overcome those problems just like everybody else in order for learning to be meaningful and free out of a sense of accomplishment.
Okay. Another practical implication comes around teaching. And so it's important for us as educators to think about and build on and create, take advantage of opportunities for self-observation, evaluation, and reinforcement. So teaching our students how to observe themselves, evaluate themselves, and move towards internal reinforcing for certain activities. And also to teach our students to have positive expectations of themselves, that they can learn how to do things, that they will learn how to do things, and they will be able to exercise those kinds of controls over themselves, their environment, and so on, that would be developmentally appropriate for them, rather than sort of giving up and saying, I can't do that, I will never learn how to do that. And at the same time, being aware as educators of both the opportunities in the environment and the constraints in the environment, and looking on expanding the opportunities for students while limiting the constraints that exist for the students in the school. And to help our students understand, become more aware of their own personal possibilities and strengths and limitations within different environments, and start to problem solve their way out of some of those limitations.
It's important that we teach students, all students, but including students with disabilities, how their personal strengths can be supported and enhanced. In other words, if they need a note taker, they don't just need us to recognize that. They need to be able to come forward and say to a new teacher or a teacher the following year, I need a note taker. Or if they need preferential seating so that they're closer to the front of the classroom so they can see the blackboard because of a low vision, or they can hear the teacher more effectively because they're hard of hearing, they need to be able to say in new environments, I need to be at the front. I need to be able to see this information in a magnified format on my computer or whatever it happens to be. I need a talking book. So they need to be aware of, and we need to teach them how to be aware of, how to support their own strengths through learning technologies, through learning scaffolds, through peer supports, other personnel supports, and institutional services, whatever's available. And we also need to teach them how to select and modify the environment that they're in. If they need to work individually on something as opposed to in a group because they can't figure out what's going on when too many people are talking, then they need to be able to say that's what my needs are. Or if they need to work with a peer in order to be successful so that someone can act as a scribe, for example, if they have fine motor skill difficulties and can't write and someone else can write their ideas down for them, they need to be able to say, I need a peer, I need you to do this. And not to feel a sense of shame. We all ask others to assist us at all stages of our lives. Almost every day you're asking the people around you to do something on your behalf, and you do things on their behalf.
Okay, and in addition, it's important to teach our students self-advocacy skills. And so again, how personal limitations might be mitigated or lessened, how to appeal inadequate provisions, and how to access and use institutional social supports for advocacy and inclusion.
Yeah, the thing here is not just that there is a procedure for appealing inadequate provisions or gaining access to institutional and social supports, but that the individual with disabilities knows how to do it and knows how to access and knows what the landscape of supports are that are available to him or her. That's not something that's automatically apparent. I'm getting older. I sometimes need an elevator where I might have used stairs at some point earlier in my life. I need to be able to recognize where the elevator is and find it. It's not always so easy, you know.
And finally, it's important to provide inclusive technology, largely based on universal design for learning principles that would enable students to be able to access their environment and access ways that they can make decisions for themselves. It's important to provide a barrier-free environment as much as possible for individuals, to develop and rely on inclusive policies around eliminating segregation and promoting valued social roles for all of our students in schools, and to adopt and use inclusive teaching through scaffolding, through differentiated instruction, and other related strategies to make sure that what we're teaching is fully accessible to all of our students. And finally, to provide good faith advocates and interveners who are prepared to work with and on behalf of our students.
Thank you very much. It's been great to have this opportunity to speak with you today. We hope that this contributes to a successful conference. Thank you. From Canada.